In June of 323 BC, the most powerful man in the world was dying. Alexander of Macedon, known to history as Alexander the Great, was burning up with a fever that refused to go away. It had started days earlier after Alexander had taken part in a drinking party in Babylon. The banquet was being held in honor of one of his admirals, a man named Nearchus, and it took place inside the palace of Nebuchadnezzar II. You see, all the achievements of his past conquests had not filled Alexander's appetite for war and expansion. He was in Babylon because his eyes had turned to a new territory that he planned to launch an invasion of next. This time around, the target was the Arabian Peninsula, and after that he dreamed of conquering North Africa, which included the budding city-state of Carthage. The direct next step in these plans included launching 1,000 warships across the Persian Gulf to carry his army into Arabia. The leader of this invasion was going to be one of his most trusted admirals, that same man that they were celebrating, Nearchus. By the evening of the party, most of Alexander's plans for the invasion were firmly in place. The conquest was only weeks away, so Alexander invited Nearchus into the Babylonian palace to be the man of honor at the feast. But the celebration of future glories would prove to be a moment in history most famous for what came immediately after. It turned out to be the last night of health for Alexander the Great, and its events would become the source of speculation about the cause of his sudden death 11 days later. Because there are lots of different versions of Alexander's final days written by historians centuries later, first thing we can do in investigating the truth is to piece together the consensus events that they all agreed happened that fateful evening. First, it's generally accepted that Alexander attended not just one drinking party that evening, but two. After feasting with his army and honoring Nearchus, Alexander received a second invitation to continue the night's festivities. This came from a man named Medius of Larissa, who was an officer in the Macedonian fleet and who had been a drinking party for Alexander in the past. The second party was a small private affair that probably included about 20 guests who were all close companions of Alexander. Some of his most trusted officers and friends would have been in attendance, including men who had become crucial figures following his death, such as his generals Ptolemy and Cassander. It's important to note that none of the sources seem to indicate that Alexander was sick before the second party, and just the fact that he accepted the invitation seems to point to him not yet being seriously ill. There is also consensus that this private party's central activity was heavy drinking, specifically large flagons of uncut wine. At some point, Alexander downed a huge 12-pint cup of wine dedicated to Hercules, only to begin showing discomfort after he finished the drink. So if we stay on this path of consensus, the events after Alexander left the second party differ slightly, but overall follow a similar pattern. Alexander grew increasingly sick following the event, with symptoms such as fever, chills, and abdominal pain. And over the next few days, his condition continued to grow worse. At first, he tried to brush off the sickness and continue his work on planning the invasion. Nearchus visited him multiple times over the next few days, and the two men discussed how they would conquer Arabia. He was also brought to the baths to try and bring down his fever, but nothing seemed to help. By the 6th day of his sickness, Alexander was bedridden and unable to stand. 2 days later, he could barely move or speak. With the end coming quickly, he called his most trusted generals to his side. Now, there are multiple different versions of Alexander's final moments, and they each have repercussions on what happened following his death. According to the historian Diodorus, his marshals gathered around the king. Alexander handed his signet ring to one of his most trusted generals and personal bodyguard, a man named Perdiccas. Then he was asked to whom he bequeathed his kingdom, and Alexander replied with a phrase that meant, quote, "to the strongest." In this account, Alexander intended for his generals to battle it out and see who deserved to claim his legacy. But other historians dispute this story and claim that what Alexander had actually said was something similar sounding, which actually meant to Craterus. Craterus was one of Alexander's most trusted generals who had been recently given regency over Macedonia. This was indeed the truth. The fact that Craterus was in Macedonia might have led the other marshals to intentionally mishear Alexander's last words. And then, of course, there's historians who deny that either of these stories are fact and claim that Alexander was completely unable to speak by the time he passed away. In their view, he made no decision for his succession, and the tales of his last words were invented by his men that were reaching for power after his death. Regardless of what happened, the next day he fell unconscious, and by June 10th, Alexander the Great had been declared dead. He was just 32 years old. So who or what is actually responsible for the death of the great king? The central divide over Alexander's death is whether the cause was natural or unnatural. Much of the debate comes out of the differing way sources describe the scene in Medea's party, especially the way that some historians have described the king crying out in pain after he finished his cup of uncut wine. Many who have looked at this description, along with the list of symptoms that Alexander experienced in the days of the party, such as abdominal pain, shock, and fear, see a pattern that are consistent with poison. To these people, the evidence seems clear that Alexander must have been murdered, most likely through a substance administered in the wine cup. Perhaps the most important famous person to believe Alexander had been murdered was actually his own mother, Olympias. She believed that her son had been poisoned by his cupbearer, a man named Iolaus, who was the son of Alexander's general, Antipater. Olympias even went so far as to desecrate the tomb of Iolaus after he was eventually killed, which happened during the resulting civil war. Among the theories of poisoning, the most common substance suspected of being put in Alexander's cup is arsenic, which is used in the modern day as rat poison. At first glance, the symptoms that Alexander experienced seem to fit well with arsenic poisoning. There are quite a few historians who put forth this exact theory of arsenic poisoning, including one writer who considers Ptolemy himself the likely perpetrator of Alexander's murder, conspiracy with other marshals. However, if you look into this theory, it starts to fall apart when the timeline of Alexander's last days are considered. If Alexander was indeed given arsenic in his wine cup, then it should have been fast-acting. A lethal dose of such a poison shouldn't have taken 11 days to slowly bring the king down, which is what happened to him. And even if the poison had been administered in smaller, more frequent doses, perhaps as part of the meals he received during his last days, the motivation for such a methodology just doesn't seem to make much sense. It seems logical that any man trying to assassinate the most powerful leader in the world would want the job done quickly. Spreading out the poison over many days and doses would increase the risk of being caught in the act with no foreseeable benefit to the man administering the poison. So, with murder likely out of the question, more natural causes like infectious disease are the next options. In this camp of theories, the most likely culprit is a creature much smaller than the men Alexander faced on the battlefields. In this case, the blame falls on the simple mosquito. Because of the time Alexander had spent in the marshes of Babylon, many theorized that his death might have been caused by either malaria or West Nile virus that he had picked up weeks earlier from an insect bite. Other diseases like typhoid fever that were commonly present in Babylon could be additional potential causes of Alexander's illness. First glance, these diseases don't necessarily fit as neatly with the descriptions in the sources as poisoning seems to. However, it's possible that these accounts were embellished by ancient historians for dramatic purposes. And this would cause Alexander's final days to look like a lot less like typical death through illness than they might have been in reality. Alright, and we'll leave you with this, one more set of fascinating theories around his death. This branch includes perhaps the most disturbing possibility that perhaps the actual cause of Alexander's death was at the hand of his embalmers, cutting open and disemboweling a man who nobody realized was actually still alive. Now, it's a wild claim, and to understand this branch of theories, it helps to know a bit about the forms of ancient medicine used at the time of Alexander. Rather than determining if someone was alive based on a pulse, the usual method used was to check for breath. It was when there seemed to be no sign of breath from Alexander that he was officially declared dead. But with modern medicine, we now know of many potential illnesses and disorders that might have put Alexander into a type of coma, where his breathing dropped to an undetectable level, but he would have been still very much alive. One example was a theory that was put forth by a historian named Catherine Hall, and she proposed that many of Alexander's symptoms, including the gradual paralysis that seemed to take over his body the last days, might have been the result of an autoimmune disorder named Guillain-Barré syndrome. The most interesting result of a diagnosis like this is the possibility that it might explain the most extraordinary detail in the story of Alexander's death, which is why his body didn't seem to be decomposing even after 6 days sitting out in the hot sun. And this is a true detail that was claimed by Egyptian workers who arrived to oversee the embalming process. If it's really true, then the only logical explanation is that he must have still been alive and suffering in a completely paralyzed state that could be explained only by something like GBS. And I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that this would be the most famous case of an incorrect diagnosis of death ever recorded in human history. In the end, with the limited and unreliable sources that we have available, it's impossible to know for sure what caused Alexander's death. But what we can be more certain about is the effect his sudden and unexpected death had on the world that he had conquered. An empire that seemed destined to reach the end of the earth suddenly stopped its conquest in its tracks. Men who had been unified and fighting side by side suddenly turned against one another in the struggle for power. Perhaps can't help but wonder if Alexander had been given more time to prepare for his own death, he might have prevented such a disastrous ending to his great empire. And there are many questions that we will almost assuredly never know about Alexander's death, but this hasn't stopped more than 2,000 years of searching to understand what happened those few dramatic days in Babylon. Ultimately, there's really only one place where any final answers could ever be found. Such truths would be hidden with his actual body, buried within his lost tomb. Only if someone uncovered the tomb could we potentially get answers to one of history's greatest mysteries.